Here is some data that I downloaded from 538's GitHub page. And the original data file had lots more columns than this, but I deleted all but these three. And we're going to import these three into Mathematica. And so one thing that helps is to start out in the right directory or start out in the same directory as the file. And so normally you get some drop-down menu here that helps you choose the directory, but I've noticed that if you've just started Mathematica, then this doesn't show up. Okay, so let me just go up here and get Mathematica started by evaluating 2 plus 3. Okay, and now if I go here, I can choose the directory. Okay, and I'm already in the right one, but if I wasn't, I could navigate to it. So let's choose this one. And now let's import. And here's the CSV file we were just looking at. And notice in the CSV file that the top row was different from the other rows. The top row was what's called a header line. And we can help Mathematica accurately import this file by telling it how many header lines there are. And in this case, there's one. And this would be okay to evaluate with shift plus return right now, but then I'm not going to have easy access to the data that gets imported. So let me name this with a variable name, and let me call it data. Okay, that worked. And like often happens in Mathematica, it got imported as a list of lists. So the total list is length 8,000. And if we were to go back here, there are about 8,000 rows in this CSV file. And if I look at something like the first row of my, or I shouldn't call it first row, the first entry in my list, it's this length 3 list here. And if I look at the second element in that, I get this state name Wyoming. And if I want to see what's the data type of that, I can check by using this word head. And so it's telling me that this Wyoming is a string. Okay, what's this going to correspond to? This is going to correspond to the first one says that we're in this list. The second one says we want the first entry in this list. So let's see what that is. So notice that's also a string. And yeah, that'll come up later. So rather than using all 8,000 of these lists, I only want to use the inside lists corresponding to California. So how can I get those? Well, here's one way. I want cases in this data list of all, let's say, X, such that the second entry in X is California. And so I've made two mistakes here. Do you see what they are? So one of them is that I wanted to compare these two things, so I should have used two equal signs to compare the equality. And the second mistake, well, the hint is that this is in blue, so it's not being treated as a string yet. So to get a string, I put it in quotation marks. Okay, there, that worked. So let me hide this output by double-clicking over here on the rightmost bracket. And let me show you another way I could have gotten this. I could do cases, data of, remember this underscore stands for anything. So we want all the things inside of data that look like a list, where the first element in the list could be anything. The second element in the list could be California. The third element in the list could be anything. And that also works. And here's one advantage of this way is maybe I want to name the first anything something, like let's name it X, and let's name the second anything Y. Okay, so that did not change anything. But the nice thing is I can use this, what's called a rule with the arrow here, to say replace all of that stuff with X comma Y. So all of the Californias, because remember that information is sort of redundant by this point because everything corresponds to California now. So here I got rid of California and said just keep X and keep Y. And if I wanted to, I could have had like y plus 100. Okay, so here it's like x, y plus 100. So you have lots of flexibility for what to do here. Good. I'll just keep it like this. And let's call this CAL for California. And you might want me to use a capital C, but we shouldn't start any variable names or custom functions in Mathematica with capital letters. And one advantage of that is because I know that capital letters are used for built-in functions and built-in constants in Mathematica. I can use a very common word like this word data as long as it's lowercase for my own variable, whereas in MATLAB, personally, I would hesitate to name a variable data, and I'd probably call it something like my data back in MATLAB. So I'm going to name this list that's sort of grayed out here. I'm going to name that CAL. And let's try to plot it using a built-in function called datelistPlot. So it didn't work. Why didn't it work? Well, this is what I was getting at before when we checked that these first elements in the inside lists were strings. And datelistPlot, it wants a date here. And so even though we can look at it as humans and tell that's a date, Mathematica by default doesn't know it's a date. So let's make an adjustment to this cal. Let me call it cal2. And let's go through each thing. So I'm going to use the second type of iterator. So for each list in cal, I'm going to replace that with, okay, well, let me start by not doing anything. Okay, this is just a really complicated way of saying keep cal exactly the same. And so I want to do something to this first entry, to the date part, to tell Mathematica to interpret it as a date. And I can use the built-in function dateObject. And it gives a warning that it isn't sure whether this 10, 12, 20, whether that corresponds to 1920 or 2020. But you can see that it chose correctly as 2020. So I can just ignore these warnings here. Okay, so let me suppress that. Okay, now I can go back to this date list plot. And I really like how automated it is. Like you can see that it's zoomed in here to a nice portion of the y-axis, and you can see that it's automatically named the x-axis with relevant month names here. And there are all sorts of options associated to this. Okay, I could get them by looking up date list plot. And I could see some of the options here. And let me just show you one of them before I end the video. I'm going to say filling, and let's fill this in to the axis. Okay, so there's one of the many options for like how to adjust this plot that is shown.